Welcome to Dornsife Dialogues. This is our last event of 2020, and despite that all we've been through together during this grueling year, Dornsife Dialogues has been a bright spot. Bringing this series online has provided us with a terrific opportunity to connect with our extended Dornsife family, and including those of you who are too far away to join us for our normal events. So I hope you'll continue to tune in when we pick this up in January. Another bright spot recently has been that 2 or 3 of the COVID-19 vaccines are proving to be highly effective. But medical breakthroughs are just part of the equation. There are also a number of social, ethical, and organizational challenges that we have to overcome before we can get back to some degree of normal. And one of the unknowns is the degree to which the public will accept a vaccine when one is made available. In 2019, the WHO ranked vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 global threats to global health. This issue has a long history stemming from a variety of sources, including misinformation, trust issues with the government and the pharmaceutical industry, and challenges in communication about basic science, just to name a few. So for us to successfully vaccinate a sufficiently large percentage of the population for COVID-19 to cease to be a public health threat, we're going to have to grapple with some of these really complex questions. So we are joined today by a terrific panel of our experts who are here to help us do just that, spanning the fields of biology, immunology, history, and political science. Our moderator is Susan Forsburg, Distinguished Professor of Science and Engineering and Professor of Biological Sciences. Susan's research explores how cells maintain their DNA accurately when they replicate, and what happens when there are mutations to these basic building blocks, work that is incredibly important to understanding cancer. In addition to being a world-renowned scientist, Susan has received a number of prestigious honors for her dedication to teaching and mentorship, particularly in the support of women in science. I will now turn it over to Susan to introduce the rest of our terrific panel. Again, thank you all for joining us, and have a happy holiday season.
And thank you, Dean Miller. Our panel today encompasses everything from history to science to ethics, and our panelists will be speaking in order, having some conversation, and also we will be answering some selected questions from you, our audience. Our speakers today are Dr. Aro Velmet, an assistant professor of history, Dr. Myron Goodman, a professor of biological sciences and chemistry, Dr. Paula Cannon, professor of microbiology in the Keck School of Medicine, and Dr. Alison Dundes Renteln, the professor of political science and co-editor of a book, Global Bioethics and Human Rights. And we're going to start with Aro, who is going to talk to us a little bit about the history of vaccines and vaccinology.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Susan. Well, I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, and really this is quite easy to do because I think in a lot of ways the takeaway message is that we have known the basic principles of how vaccines work really for quite a long time, and it's not so much the theory of how vaccines work that we've an issue with. It's more the practical aspects of distribution and trust. So if we wanted to know where do vaccines come from, then really the answer, one is the history of smallpox, and then two, really as best as we can tell, is the history of care work. Because as far as we know, that the principle that certain diseases generate immunity, that once you've had them, you can no longer fall ill, was observed by care workers. Because when people had smallpox, people observed that there were certain people who were then safe from the disease and then could engage in care work in communities where people had been infected. And as best as we can tell, this led people to then experiment with the idea that, okay, well, maybe we can take small so to speak, matter of the disease and use it to give people a kind of attenuated form of that disease to then induce immunity. And then this led to what was called variolation. And this really happened around the globe in a number of different places. The earliest evidence we have of variolation comes from China, comes from the Ottoman Empire, and it goes back, at least 300 or so years, maybe more, but roughly the beginning of the 18th century is when we have first recorded evidence of variolation happening in those places. So fast forward about 150 years to the mid-19th century, and then we get to the point where we can really talk about the modern era of vaccines, when scientists start cultivating attenuated forms of pathogenic microbes with the precise goal of producing vaccines, these pharmaceuticals that can then protect us from actually acquiring the real disease. And this really centers around the figure of Louis Pasteur, who many people call the father of modern microbiology, alongside Robert Koch and a couple of other people, who develops the first vaccines against, for instance, rabies in the late 19th century. So even in the era of sort of modern vaccines, we've got about 150 years of solid experience to work with. So, so as far as the kind of scientific and theoretical side is concerned, the experience is really very long and very solid. Historically, places where challenges have occurred have really been in distribution and in building trust. Because coming up with the idea of a vaccine is one thing, but making sure that there's enough of it to go around to vaccinate large numbers of people, to deliver it to places that have very variable levels of infrastructure, that's really been where the challenge has been at. And then the other side of that, that challenge has to do with generating trust, because vaccines have often, for all the good that they've done in public health, the trialing and administering of vaccines historically has come with a number of high-profile problems where, vaccines have been unethically trialed, oftentimes in colonized territories, in, for instance, French territories in West Africa and Indochina, in American-occupied Cuba and places like that. And those have generated significant amounts of mistrust, which then, subsequent generations have had to overcome. So it's really on that side that happens after the science has been done, when the vaccine rolls out, that most of the problems have come up historically.
Thank you, Aro. Giving us a little background of some of the issues there. Myron is going to talk to us about some of the biology of immunity and the basics of vaccinology.
The question is, why don't you die when I sneeze? And the reason is because you have a good immune system. And I'm enveloping you quite often in particles, invaders, that you may not have seen before. And typically these particles and invaders are referred to a catch-all term of antigens. And you have a good immune system. And so what you do is you manufacture antibodies that are going to then neutralize, is the technical term, but in point of fact, what's happening is you're inactivating the antigens that I'm covering you with. And the way that this happens is in human beings, higher organisms, we have something which is called adaptive immunity. And so we have a lymphatic system that can manufacture proteins. And these proteins are called antibodies. And the antibodies can bind to the infectious organisms that are entering you from my sneeze or elsewhere. And when they bind to them, they can essentially inactivate. They cause them not to be able to do what they want to do. And the antibodies have to be manufactured very, very rapidly, matters of days or several days or maybe a week. And they also have to be very fluid, because originally when antibodies get manufactured, they may not be very good at binding to the invaders, but they can get better at binding to the invaders via mutagenic processes. And what they wind up doing is combine to the invaders and be very, very good at inactivating them and neutralizing them. And so we're all very familiar now with COVID-19. And so what happens is COVID-19 comes in, it infects you, and you want to get an immune response against COVID-19. And so in order to do that, you have to hope that you can overcome the noxious effects of COVID-19, but that's very, very, very difficult to do, as we found out in this pandemic. And so what we really need is a vaccine. And so what's a vaccine doing? Well, COVID-19 has various aspects of it, especially on its envelope, on the outside of COVID-19. You might have run into in the newspapers something which is called the spike protein. And the COVID-19 spike proteins are sitting on the outside of it, and it needs a spike protein in order to infect us. So what's a vaccine doing? A vaccine is tricking our immune system into thinking it's coming under lethal attack by COVID-19. But what the vaccine is really doing is it's enabling you to make antibodies against a part of the COVID-19, such as the spike protein. So you're really coming under non-lethal attack. So what happens is, when you make the antibodies against the spike protein, which the COVID needs in order to make you sick, what happens when you make those antibodies, when you really, if you've been vaccinated or you're now immune, when the COVID does attack, then what happens is the antibodies that were made in response to the vaccine now attack those portions of the COVID-19 that it requires in order to make you sick. And so it then inactivates or basically renders harmless the COVID-19. So the innocuous invader stimulates the antibody production, but it doesn't make you sick. And so, having been born and raised in Brooklyn, I learned a very important thing, probably by the age of 5 years old. And the strategy is, do unto others before they do unto you. And that's the strategy of the vaccine. Kill the invader before it can cause you any problems. And that's the basic strategy of it. And so one other point that I would like to make has to do with herd immunity, because this is a question that has been raised quite a bit. And in order to achieve herd immunity, you really need to have something of the order of 70 to 80% of the population have to have developed neutralizing or inactivating antibodies against the antigens. And so once you've done that, you've managed to get herd immunity by vaccination, I just want to make the point that not everybody in the herd is going to have been vaccinated. And so the question is, what happens to those people who are in the herd that have denied and that have not wanted to be vaccinated? And the answer to that question is, they are not going to get infected from COVID-19 from the herd, but they're still susceptible to be getting infected, but it won't be from the herd. And the last point I want to make is that vaccines work. And so, for example, smallpox has been eradicated. Polio should now be eradicated except for politics. And Ebola is very well controlled despite politics.
Thank you, Myron. And I think the real take home here is that the vaccine allows us to supercharge our immune system so that it meets the invader with an overwhelming show of force without having to delay. And it's a beautiful, superb system. It's really quite elegant, and Myron studies many aspects of that.
Do unto others before they do unto you.
So we will move on to Paula, who will talk a little more specifically about the COVID vaccines that we're hearing more about.
Thanks, Susan. Hopefully you guys can hear me. My neighbor's leaf blower has just started up. They wait till I go live. So I think everybody's actually kind of really interested and excited about the potential COVID vaccines. And the good news is that we're going to have a menu with some different options. And I think that's important, because having different types of vaccines means that different groups who may not be able to take one type or another, there's still going to be something on the table for you. So let's talk about the different types. So Myron just explained the idea that our immune system makes antibodies that can then stick to and neutralize a virus when it gets into our body. And so the idea of a vaccine is we're fooling the immune system into thinking it's actually already been infected by a virus and making those antibodies. So one of the things on the outside of the virus, I think everybody's used to this picture now of the coronavirus with these red spikes. That's the spike protein. That's the biggest outside piece of the virus, and that's where our antibodies want to recognize and bind to. So how can we do it? Well, the simplest way is you can actually take virus and you can kill it. You can inactivate it with a chemical, and then that dead virus, which still looks like a virus, still has all its spikes, that can be injected into people. And the body thinks it's under attack from the virus and makes the antibodies. So that's a dead virus. It's actually usually, super safe, super effective. And the vaccines, for example, that China have already injected into 1 million of their citizens are all these types of inactivated or dead vaccines. The next type is you can make what's called a subunit vaccine. Here, we literally just take the spike off the outside of the virus, we grow it up in a lab, and then we inject just that spike protein into people. And again, the body doesn't know that it's not under attack from a virus. It makes antibodies that react to that spike protein. You develop immunity, but you've only been infected, if you like, with just a small piece of the virus that couldn't cause the disease in you. The third type of vaccine is called a vector vaccine. And here it's kind of a cute trick. Here you take a virus like a common cold virus, an adenovirus. You scoop out some of the genetic material that that virus has naturally, so it can't actually really infect people. And then you replace it with a piece of the genetic material from the coronavirus that allows that virus to now make, you've guessed it, the spike protein. And so when those vector vaccines are injected into people, for a short period of time, they will make the spike protein in the body, and that then generates antibodies against the spike protein. And that's the type of vaccine that, for example, the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are, as well as the Sputnik vaccine in Russia that has also been injected into a lot of people so far. And then the final type, which are kind of the new kids on the block, these are the RNA vaccines, and these are the ones that are being made by Pfizer and Moderna. So RNA vaccines are a new technology, but my goodness, I'm kind of excited in 2020 we have them, because what they've got going for them is they allow the very rapid development of a vaccine. What are they? So RNA is like instructions that if you inject RNA into the body and it goes into a cell, it provides just the instructions to make, for a short period of time, some spike proteins. So RNA vaccines are very effective, I think. They're very short-lived, and they can be very potent. They are different than the other vaccines in that they can be made entirely by a chemical process. So what's good about that is that it means that it's simpler to manufacture them. We're not likely to run out of the raw ingredients, for example, because you only need vanishingly small amounts to be injected into people, and yet they can still be effective. There is a downside. As you may have heard, these RNA vaccines are exquisitely unstable. They need to be kept at crazy low temperatures, -70 degrees centigrade, which is, not what we have in our average kitchens or even our local pharmacies. So there may be some initial challenges to delivering, shipping, and storing these types of RNA vaccines, but nothing, we and most other countries can't overcome. So that's a high-level view of the different types of vaccines, and I think I would just say that so far it's been extraordinary how good they all look, and there will be choices, different countries, maybe at different times, different vaccines will come online, and we need as many as we can get so that we can give vaccines and cover as many people as possible and as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Paula. There's several questions in the Q&A asking about the longevity of the immune response and how long people will remain immune following vaccination. Can you address that?
Sure. So we don't know is the first answer, because we've only just started vaccinating people. Sometimes when you get a vaccine, it lasts for life. you get a measles vaccine and you're good. Other vaccines, as people know, you tend to need boosters like a tetanus vaccine, for example. And that's because the immunity wanes over time. We don't yet know what type of vaccines these coronavirus vaccines will be. I think one of the things, we can get some clues, we can look at the level of antibodies, which are what vaccines create present in the blood. And we could come back after 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years and say, have those antibody levels stayed high or are they starting to go down, which would indicate that maybe immunity is waning. There is also, Elodie, I'm going to get technical, another type of the immune system that's equally as important, apart from antibodies. It's called T-cell immunity. Much harder to measure in just a spot of blood. But I think there's some evidence from natural coronavirus infections that even if people's antibodies go down over time, this cell-based T-cell immunity stays pretty robust. So I think there's an expectation that these vaccines, the immunity will last at least a couple of years. And if it does start to wane, we all know what to do. You go and get your booster shot. And maybe your coronavirus vaccine becomes an annual ritual that you package in with your flu vaccine. And again, that's, it's less than perfect, but it's not that bad.
This might be a good point to just interject something a little bit technical. And part of the immune system has some cells available to it that remember that you've been infected. They're called memory cells. And so what that enables you to do is, if you're infected a second time, some of those cells, having remembered being infected the first time, can generate a very rapid response. That's part of the repertoire of fighting against disease.
Thank you, Myron. I would also note that we're all familiar with the fact that we get a flu vaccine every year, but we only get essentially one measles vaccine. Measles is an incredibly successful vaccination. The flu is a highly changeable virus, so it's constantly changing. It doesn't, as far as I'm aware, it does not look like COVID changes nearly that frequently for various specialty reasons.
No, thank goodness. I always say, like, it missed that trick, It's just, if you're really going to like wipe out the world's population, you need to also be a virus that is constantly changing and staying one step ahead of both our natural immunity and our vaccines. And the coronavirus does not do that at all. So thank goodness, it's very vanilla. It stays the same flavor.
Just the point of interjection here, and that is, it's not to a virus is an advantage to wipe out the whole population of the world, because that it will be wiping itself out as well.
Yeah, but it's not thinking. It's not that's one thing. There's a really good question in the Q&A asking if people who are vaccinated can still be carriers of the virus or transmit it, and that's actually a really good point, because the first thing is asking whether the vaccination is protecting you from getting the disease, but could you have a transient infection and still shed the virus? And we don't have the answer to that, as far as I know. Paula?
That's true. These initial trials that have been ongoing, typically about 50,000 people receiving the Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca vaccines. What the trial organizers are looking for is, does this stop people getting COVID? And the way they do that is they're looking for people who have symptoms. So what they don't yet know is whether or not people who've been vaccinated may still get COVID and just not show any symptoms, which is good. It means that the immune system is at least partially thwarting the virus. But then that would be a concern if people got infected, didn't know because they didn't have symptoms, went about their daily business, but still had enough virus in their body that they could transmit it to other people. So that is a concern. And it may be that we, as we get further on in the vaccination, we start to unpack that. I would say that in general, I would expect there to be a correlation that if you have a vaccine that builds up enough immunity in you, that even if you get infected, you have a very mild disease. That means there's going to be low levels of the virus in your body. It's partially under control, and therefore your ability to transmit it should also be equally damped down. So I would expect that the two things would go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's our hope. And I think there's a lot of a number of questions in the chat asking if the mRNA vaccines are changing your DNA permanently. They are not. It is a very transient expression. It's not a permanent change to your genome. Your genome is not being, that is your DNA, is not being modified in any way. It's a very short-term production of that protein. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We're not making genetically modified people. It's just
not at all.
Yeah.
So thank you, Paula. And I will continue to keep an eye on the chat, and we will open those questions more in a moment. But I want to ask Alison now to discuss some of the issues about the delivery, prioritization, and choice involved in vaccinating.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to Dean Miller for championing these interdisciplinary conversations and helping scholars get their ideas out to help make the world a better place. So my first thought is that we need to think of ourselves as citizens of the world. It's pretty obvious that pandemics don't pay attention to national borders. And so we need to avoid pressures to be parochial and small-minded. And for me, it's very reassuring, and to the rest of us, it should be reassuring that the United States in January will be re-engaging with the World Health Organization. I think one of the main challenges is going to be facilitating international cooperation and international coordination through the World Health Organization to ensure the fair distribution of vaccines throughout the world. So I'm planning to say just a few words about the ethical aspects of vaccination. And moral reasoning comes in many forms. And Americans tend to think in terms of cost-benefit analysis, in terms of the future impact of a policy or the consequences of it. And I want to question that, because I think a rights-based approach will give us a more just policy. And it could be that with torture, you could torture people to get information, but there are just some things that we aren't allowed to do because of our commitment to human rights. So there's certain fundamental human rights, like right against slavery, right against genocide, and these are said to be non-derogable rights. So I think that the whole discussion of biomedical ethics focuses too much on cost-benefit analysis. And so I focus on principles of justice and human rights. And you may be familiar with the idea that you should judge something based on principle. The Kantian idea is that people shouldn't be used as a means to an end. So let's turn to the question of distributive justice with the pandemic. And one of the questions is, now that we're excited to have these vaccines, how can we distribute them in a fair way? What sort of priorities should we use? Some people think that the priority should be to give the vaccine to healthcare workers and to vulnerable populations. So there's a question about what is the relevance of social status and how should that affect who receives vaccines? Lately, we've been hearing in the press that people in nursing homes should get the vaccine. But not everyone can afford to be in a nursing home, and there are cultural taboos about placing older people in nursing homes. So is the point that older people are at greater risk? If that's the point, then all older people should have access to the vaccine, not just those in nursing homes. And from a human rights point of view, all people should enjoy equal rights, and so age should not be a basis for deciding who should get the vaccine. That wouldn't be a proper way of deciding. If the logic is that we need to help people who are vulnerable and people who are in places that are unsafe because they're institutionalized, then why aren't we talking about people in prison? Shouldn't prisoners be prioritized? Shouldn't they be guaranteed access to the vaccine? And I haven't heard much discussion about homeless people, people living in conditions of homelessness. Should they be given a priority because they don't have access to a safe environment where they can avoid the access to avoid being infected? So if we shift then to talk about questions of global distributive justice, the basic question I think that we're facing is it fair for wealthier countries to pre-order supplies of vaccine, and then the poorer countries, people in poorer countries, lack access to vaccinations? Now, there are, of course, plans and groups like Gavi, alliances of NGOs working with the World Health Organization to try to avoid this problem. But there's been some discussion even in the press that one of the vaccines that has a slightly or somewhat lower rate of effectiveness is going to be sent to Africa. So there's certainly some issues that we'll want to talk about in terms of what obligations do the wealthier countries have to less affluent countries. I think in this whole discussion of distribution, we're assuming a finite resource. And so a lot of organizations like Public Citizen are arguing that we should really get the international community to incentivize or to create incentives to maximize production of vaccines to avoid problems with limited manufacturing capacity. Now, if we shift to the human rights issue, some of you may know that the right to health is codified in international human rights law. And the leading scholar who wrote a definitive treatment of this is named Bridget Toebes, T-O-E-B-E-S, at the University of Groningen. And Paul Hunt was a special researcher at the UN, and he's written on the right to medicine as a human right. So there's a great deal of scholarship about the right to health, and it means that people have a human right to the highest attainable standard of health. And if there is a human right, it's a special moral claim that people have, and that means that states and other agents are obligated to provide that fundamental right. So if there is a right to health, then for us, the question is, does the right to health include the right to vaccination? And though that's not written explicitly, I think it's understood that that's something that's part of the right to health. The other point is that if there is a right to health, then the right to health must be affordable. And so that raises the question of how are we going to handle making sure that people have a human right to the vaccination if they want to have it. If for people who are interested, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights guarantees the right to health in Article 12, and it's also codified in a bunch of other human rights treaties. But finally, one other human rights document that some people might be interested in is that there are these principles that require pharmaceutical companies to help ensure access to medicine, and these are called the Human Rights Guidelines for pharmaceutical companies in relation to access to medicine. And so I think that there's a growing consensus in the international community that we have to find ways to provide access to essential medicines, and I would argue that should include vaccinations. I'd like to talk about incentives to get people to be vaccinated, but it may be that Susan would rather save that for a little bit later.
Yeah, I think that we'll come back to that, I think. I'm continuing. I'm noticing a number of questions in the Q&A, and I want to ask Paula. People are asking questions about safety and side effects. Yep. And can you address, those are two separate things, but can you address both safety and side effects, please?
So, all right, so I'm going to take side effects first, because side effects aren't a bad thing. So the reason I want to explain is that when you get a natural infection, say you get a cold virus, all the symptoms you get, they're actually side effects of your immune system kicking into high gear, trying to fight this virus. So for example, your temperature might go up, and one of the reasons the body does that is that we know that viruses like to be at body temperature 37 degrees. And if we go a little bit higher, they can't replicate as well. So your body is doing that trick. And then, runny nose, guess what? That's trying to flush the virus out of your nasal passages. So the symptoms you get with an infection are really the side effects of your immune system trying to stop that virus. So what sort of side effects might we anticipate with this new set of coronavirus vaccines? And really, I don't think there's going to be anything that we haven't seen with other types of vaccines. And they're going to range from, frankly, 0 side effects in a lot of people to probably, I think, from what I've heard, is people seem to be getting things like a mild headache, maybe achiness in their arm, or just feeling a little bit feverish for 12 or 24 hours. And again, that's probably a good sign, because what that means is that your immune system has taken note of the vaccine that's been injected into you. It's been fooled. It thinks it's under attack from a virus, and it's ramping up and starting to make antibodies and these T cells and do all the things that it normally has to do to get rid of a natural infection. So, frankly, if you feel a little bit of a reaction to it, you should say to yourself, okay, good. my immune system's kicking into gear, and this is why I'm feeling this. The vast majority of the side effects that have been reported, you can handle with Tylenol or a good glass of water and, you know, sitting on the sofa in front of Netflix. Now, what happens if side effects are more serious? And certainly in very rare cases, they can be. And sometimes that's just, you know, we're all different people, and sometimes people respond differently. But again, nothing we've seen in the clinical trials, and especially for the RNA vaccines, where I think about 50,000 people in each trial have now been injected. There's been no serious side effects at all. So that gives me a very high degree of confidence. I don't know what's happened to the 1 million plus people in China who've been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccines. But again, you know, I think we would have heard, maybe not, maybe I'm being naive, if something bad had happened. So the other good thing I would say, Susan, is that in terms of safety, there's a huge amount of attention paid to what's happening to people who have these vaccines. So, you know, both any immediate responses as well as any more long-term responses, these all get reported. There are bodies, including the FDA, that monitor all of this. So if any side effects did start to happen, you know, that could instantly be addressed. You know, to me, I think what we've seen from the clinical trials so far has been extremely encouraging. And again, the good news is we've got a lot of different vaccines potentially to choose from, so that if some, you know, have more, you know, a more headache inducing, if you like, in a different group of people, then you can switch to the other one.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a friend who got the Moderna. I was quite confident she was in the trial that she got the real thing. Swollen arm, kind of felt a little achy for a day, and that was it. I think one of the points that Aro made early on was that errors of the past have led us to a very robust and laid out protocol for testing safety and evaluating vaccines in a much more robust way. And these are not getting a buy. They're going through a robust evaluation by the FDA and so on. And I, like Paula, remain quite confident. And I think, Aro, you had another point you wanted to make, I think.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Alison's questions, or on Alison's points about distributive justice and these ethics of who gets the vaccines and when, because I just wanted to highlight that these are, you know, so to speak, not academic matters, that these are actually issues that the world has had to deal with in the past, and those the ways that these questions have been addressed have in retrospect sometimes been quite problematic. So we can sort of think of two examples. One is, or two kinds of challenges that have occurred. One is the best analogy we have to this current issue with COVID vaccine distribution is the campaign to eradicate smallpox in the 1960s and 70s, which is really the one successful global vaccination campaign that we know. And there, this question of precisely of who gets the vaccine and when became kind of a problem. The WHO and international bodies were debating having a smallpox vaccination campaign essentially since the WHO was created in the late 1940s. And the reason that couldn't be accomplished until the 1960s and 70s was because we didn't have smallpox vaccines that were robust enough to survive in areas with you know, very little infrastructural support. So we needed to wait essentially until we had a heat-stable vaccine that could survive in, you know, 30 degrees Celsius heat in you know, places in India and Africa. We needed to develop new ways of administering the vaccine because, you know, there are, you know, places with sort of low primary healthcare capacity, did not have simply the tools and the technical know-how to do it. But there, you know, every year we lose is, you know, a number of people who die in, you know, in the case of the 20th century, smallpox, and in the current case of COVID. So the longer we ignore these questions of logistical challenges, which, you know, as Paula said, are actually quite substantial with mRNA vaccines in particular. The Pfizer vaccine requires really, really low temperature storage. The more these distributional questions have come up. And the second thing, which links up to this question of safety and efficacy, is that historically, one way this problem has been solved, for instance, with yellow fever vaccination in the 1930s and 40s, was basically not to improve the infrastructure of communities that had these kind of logistical challenges, but instead to say, okay, we'll keep this very high-tech vaccine for ourselves. The French were experimenting with several different vaccine strains in the 1930s. One required 3 booster shots, and you couldn't be feasibly administered in West Africa. So the French Pasteur Institute, on which my research is on, essentially said, okay, we'll keep this one for ourselves, but we'll develop a more easily administrable, a more robust vaccine, which actually turned out to have some pretty nasty adverse effects, and eventually led to some cases of fatalities and the vaccine essentially being discontinued. And and I've looked at correspondence between people writing to the WHO from England, essentially saying, look, we at first thought maybe we could take this vaccine and use it in London for people traveling to Africa, but now we're realizing it's the one you use on Africans, and this is a verbatim quote. So actually, we're going to give this one a pass. So a lot of these trust issues have to do with the ways these distributive challenges have been resolved in the past, and as Susan said, have then led to some serious debates over ethics and new bioethics regulations, and is also the reason why we need to keep this particular challenge at the forefront of our minds. Because if we end up with these problems of equity, of certain communities being underserved and having to wait years to get a vaccine that may not be up to the 95% standard of Moderna and Pfizer, then this is not really going to be good for building trust for vaccines in the long term.
Alison, I think you had a point.
Well, I think we're in an era now where we're looking to the past. There's a reckoning with the past, and we've talked about systemic racism, and the international human rights community has asked countries to examine their policies. So we're looking forward, and we're hoping that the decision-making will be based on science. The Food and Drug Administration, the World Health Organization has the Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety that deals with this. So I think it's good to point out historic injustices, but we're looking forward to 2021, to a time when we're much more aware of discrimination, and I hope the international community will follow through on a commitment to having more just policies for distribution. And I'd like to talk about how we can imagine creating incentives to having the vaccine distributed on a more fair basis. May I turn to that now for just a moment?
Sure.
So I was thinking that if we had, first of all, the cost of it is going to be a crucial issue. If we really want people to have the vaccine, we would make it free. We would have governments pay for it, or we would have it subsidized through the World Health Organization. We would also have medical interpreters, because we don't want a language barrier to be an obstacle to people getting the vaccine. We also can't have, we want to have the vaccines taken to the two communities, because even with drive-through clinics, that assumes people have cars. We have to make it available. If we had vans taking the vaccines to different communities, then that would help, ensure that more people would have access. If we want people to get vaccinated, we could have a vaccination holiday. That's what they do to try to get people to vote in countries where they really want to get voter turnout to increase. You have a holiday so people don't have to go to work. And there's been discussion in some places about vaccine passports, that if you want to travel somewhere, you'd better have in your passport that you've had the vaccine. I think it's under discussion in Australia. I'm sure others have ideas, but I think there's a lot of possibilities for trying to encourage people to have vaccines now that they're on the horizon.
Thank you. Alison, a question was asked in the Q&A whether some of the international treaties and agreements that you referred to in your first part of your presentation have actually been endorsed or signed on to by the United States.
So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is pretty much supported by all countries. It's not technically a treaty, but it's binding in various ways, and that includes the right to health. One of the one that I mentioned, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the United States is not a party to that treaty. That has Article 12 that guarantees the right to health. And so one thing that I think the US could do would be to ratify more of the treaties. We're the only country in the world that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But in the world community, many, many countries have ratified the treaty that guarantees the right to health. And the right to health is included in other treaties that we are part of. And so if people want to email me separately, I'll be happy to share more specific information.
Okay, thank you. I think that
Susan, I was going to say, the United States, though, is missing an opportunity here. And I think we should just say that. There is an international organization called COVAX, which is basically set up by the World Health Organization, which is to address this very issue of let's pay attention to equity and distribution of this virus, this vaccine, sorry, wrong one. And the United States is probably the only, significant country that hasn't signed on to it. We're seeing leadership from China, which has, entered into agreements to distribute its vaccine to, especially South America and throughout Asia. And we also have players like the Serum Institute of India, who are taking on, the job of producing 1 billion doses of I think one of the Chinese vaccines, and that's also going to be distributed to countries with fewer resources. So, this really is an opportunity globally for us all to kind of take stock and remember that, health is, we call it public health for a reason. It's global health. We can't just kind of, fix it in this one country. We have to look at what's happening in the rest of the world. And again, I hope that, the US will step up a little bit more and have more of an international view about this.
Thank you. I want to stress a lot of there are concerns being expressed in the Q&A about safety. Vaccination, as I think Aro has touched upon historically, is actually quite robust and very successful and has a strong safety record. People are talking about long-term effects, and this is stuff that comes out of sort of an anti-vax, anti-science thing. I am not hesitant about getting this vaccine, or indeed pretty much any others. We've been very successful. Look at smallpox, which is eradicated. Polio is eradicated in most countries. Measles should be, essentially, because if we maintain sufficient vaccination, as Myron touched on herd immunity, the idea is that protects people who potentially cannot be vaccinated for various medical reasons, meaning essentially every one of us who's vaccinated is protecting the weaker among us who, for whatever reason, immunocompromised cancer patients or whatever, who potentially cannot take a vaccine. We are providing a wall to protect one another. And I think that there's a strong social good in thinking about ourselves, not just about our own health, but the health of those around us in our community to the vaccination. Panelists, do you have other, Alison, I see you have a comment?
Well, I just want to jump in. Yeah, I think that if people would jump forward to be the ones to take the vaccine to set the example, it would be very reassuring to people. I think that that could be very important. If high profile people do that, it would be, it would be reassuring to a lot of people. The idea that they want to start with the nursing homes, I know I'm harping on this, but there are sometimes questions of capacity, a legal capacity. Are people, in a state of mind that they can agree to this? And some people may be thinking, why are they starting with the nursing homes? I mean, if people who are leaders, political leaders, celebrities, people who in the UN do this, I think that will help encourage the rest of us to go and have our vaccines.
Well, the irony is, of course, they've really started with the sports team, because the sports teams have to be in a position where they are protected so they can play. And I mean, this is really cost benefit analysis, which we got to get away from.
Yeah.
I think we can also kind of be a little bit selfish as well and think about ourselves. So maybe just to sort of center the discussion, because when people talk about vaccines and their initial and only, focus is side effects, safety, yada, yada, yada. There's no amount of me saying, every vaccine that's out there is 99.999% safe and effective. But let's just remind ourselves of what the alternative is, because the alternative is COVID. And even if you are 20 and healthy, you have a chance of significant morbidity and worse. You can pass it on to people who will have a much worse outcome. And even people who have it, I've now got a number of family members in Europe, and I have friends in this country who've had it, and they're all like, you don't want this. I was miserable. And they're the ones, who didn't have to go into hospital. I've also had friends who've died. It's getting personal. And then people who recover. We have this phenomenon that's called long COVID, which reflects the fact that the assault to your immune system that this virus produces in some people itself causes massive and long-term and very disturbing side effects. And we don't know the full extent of those. So we are playing Russian roulette here with a virus that we've only known about for less than a year, that has nasty and potentially very serious short-term effects in people, but can probably have some very significant long-term effects that we're going to hear about months and years from now. And so when I'm doing the risk-benefit analysis, to me, the vaccine is a little feather in the scale, and the risk of COVID is a couple of bull elephants in terms of risk. So that's how I think about it.
At this point, Paul, and that is the horrible situation where people recovered from polio only to get polio way later in life and became quite incapacitated for it. It was very rare, but it happened.
Alison, you had another point you wanted to make?
Well, part of the reason I've been focusing on creating incentives for people to vaccinations, because it's better to have people do this voluntarily than to have the government come in and require people to be vaccinated. But the Supreme Court in the United States has ruled on this, on the question of whether children, in order to be registered in public school, can be subject to compulsory vaccination. And the Supreme Court upheld that. It was some time ago in 1905, but it does suggest that if there's resistance to this, then we might be subject to some kind of policies that would require, in order to go to school, in order to get a passport and so on, to have to get vaccinations. The European Court of Human Rights has a case right now. They're about to decide about whether one of the member states can require compulsory vaccination for children. And so I think the government has the power, the so-called police power, to do this. It would be much better if we do what's good for the community. We have a sense of being part of the world and we do this, but I think people should be aware that the government does have the authority. Now, of course, there is a corresponding right to have an objection. So some people will have objections to having a vaccination, and that does exist in the laws. I think all 50 states, I believe, in this country have laws that allow for compulsory vaccinations for students to go to public school.
Thank you. I do want to make a note that this has been an amazing success story. The technologies that have been developed and deployed against this from basic science, the working together across national boundaries with basic scientists, the genome was published very quickly, and we've really made an amazing progress here, and it shows what humanity is capable of. But this should also be a warning, because bad as this is, it could have been even worse. And we are going to see increasing numbers of these viruses that are getting out of whatever animal reservoirs they're in and moving around. We need, as both a national and international community, to be aware of this and to be deploying appropriate measures that we can respond quickly. As some of the public health people say, public health, when it really works well, you don't even know it's there. So I think we've had a real stress test on our system and our capacity here that we need to take firm lessons from moving forward. But this has been a tremendous success story. We have another nasty few months to get through because, of course, we haven't really addressed the fact of the scale up and getting enough doses for the world of multiple vaccines will be necessary. So for most of us, we probably won't see this before. Paula, would you say next spring, next summer?
So the timeline, the best timeline estimate we have now is that, as you know, the United Kingdom's just started, just announced today, they're going to start making the Pfizer vaccine available. Here in the US, both Pfizer and Moderna are going up to the FDA on, I think, the 10th and 17th of December, and have both said that within 3 or 4 days of being given emergency use authorization, they will start shipping their vaccine. The healthcare workers, the nursing homes, the sort of people who will initially get the vaccines, that'll be happening before the end of the year. And then I think Tony Fauci recently speculated that, you know, what is the time frame for what did he, I think he said something like a healthy 20-year-old with no underlying conditions walking into a CVS and being able to get a vaccine. And he was speculating that would be April. I suspect it might be even sooner than that, because again, I'm just sort of thinking through that we've got this pipeline of these different vaccines that are all going to start to come online. So, you know, you pay attention to what's happening with your own sort of healthcare providers. They'll start to be sending out information. Here in Los Angeles, CEDARS is going to be what's called a pre-positioning depot. That's going to be getting a lot of the Pfizer vaccine coming in and then distributing it. One of the other major centers that's going to be in Los Angeles, one of the first to come online, which is going to start vaccinating people this month, is St. John's Family Center down in South Los Angeles. It's an FQHC. It serves a very underserved population. So I love the fact that in California, you know, one of the first centers in the country that's going to be able to vaccinate its people is going to be in South Los Angeles. And that, I think, speaks to what sort of Alison was talking about earlier, that we recognize there are inequities, but in 2020, people are kind of on this, and we're thinking about it, and we're thinking how to make sure that we can roll out this vaccine in a way that's more equitable than, you know, previous vaccines have been.
I think it's worth noting also that we're not done with vaccines, right? So with the mRNA vaccines, for various reasons, could scale up and be tested more quickly. AstraZeneca is still running. There's a number of other vaccines in the pipeline. We're going to need a lot of them. So we're going to need multiple modalities. So we're not finished in testing, evaluating, and deploying vaccines. So my expectation is that by next summer, we're going to have a very wide distribution of a number of different possibilities, some of which will be easier to distribute than the ones that require a -80 than others. But the idea is to get as many people vaccinated as possible. So we're not done yet at all. And I want to put this on a level, a measure of hope in what we have accomplished.
I'd like to bring up again the mass incarceration issue. There could have been compassionate release of people. And instead of focusing only on nursing homes, I just want to reiterate that there are a lot of people of color who are in institutions, and we really need to think about their right to vaccinations or better compassionate release for those who have not, who are, I guess, over 50 and don't pose any threat to the community.
So I'm going to ask of our panelists if you want to have any summation or finish up before we conclude our webinar.
I mean,
Go ahead.
I would just like to echo what Paula and Susan have said from a historical perspective. You know, it is really remarkable, and I can't state this enough, that we have gotten from, you know, this disease first being identified in December of last year, and, you know, Chinese researchers, you know, going against essentially the orders of the government and uploading the genetic code of that disease online so that the people at Moderna, at Pfizer, could start working on it, to a viable vaccine in a year. Following all the research protocols, all the safety regulations. You know, normally this takes a decade at the fastest. So, you know, the amount of lives saved by this will be really stunning. And, you know, not the alternative, as Paula was saying, is not only just COVID. The alternative for vaccines in history has always been political conflict, because the alternative to vaccination are the kinds of lockdowns, the kinds of, you know, economically and socially disruptive public health measures that are effective and that are the best tools that we have, but we have seen over the course of the past year are also incredibly divisive and you know, incredibly hurtful for a lot of people, for people's mental well-being, for people's economic well-being. So the sooner we can get this vaccine to everyone around the world, the sooner, you know, this will have repercussions for everyone's daily lives, just, you know, well beyond simply people's safety from this one particular disease.
But, you know, we recognize, Aro, that in a real sense you're preaching to the choir here. And unfortunately, we currently have a situation where a significant fraction of the people in this country who have at least gone through some level of education don't believe in the science. And so this is an educational challenge that we have, in addition to vaccine distribution, is a recognition of making people aware of what their responsibilities are in terms of the society, but also in appreciating the science. And so we do understand the aspects of the science, but there are a significant fraction of people in this country who don't. They don't believe it.
So I'm gonna...
I was just reading some of the questions in the chat. So I wanted to give people one explanation. When people say these vaccines can't be safe because they've been rushed, everything's happened so quickly. So the perspective is that it takes an awful lot of money to develop a vaccine. So normally what happens is a company starts off over here and they do this experiment and they wait until they get the answer before they do the next experiment, or they do bigger, and they don't go into large, what are called phase 3 trials with 50,000 people until they've got the results from all these earlier stages, because it's just a crazy amount of money. What's happened in 2020 with COVID is governments and foundations have all kind of chipped in and said, look, here you go, here's the money. Do as many things as you can simultaneously, so that when we get the results, we kind of get everything together to look at and present to the FDA, and we're not waiting. So yes, time has been compressed, but steps have not been missed. It's just that everything's been done together, and the only risk really was just, you could have lost a lot of money. Seems like a small price to pay if the end result is we now have what looks like a series of extremely effective vaccines that, I'm excited to see, what happens and how many, you can almost have a party like, which one did you get? I think they're all going to work. They all look like they're all going to work.
So Paula, that leads us to a question several people have asked. Which one should they get?
Oh, so my day job, I'm a gene therapist, so I would go for the RNA one just because I'm really curious to have an RNA vaccine. And I will say, for people who are freaking out a bit or saying RNA, I don't want to have RNA put into me. Every time you get a virus, at least for a few days or a weeks, you've got foreign DNA or RNA in your body. That's what that virus is. And your body clears them out and they go away. And you don't walk around afterwards as a genetically mutated human being with a bit of measles virus in you, okay? So this RNA is fragile. That's why we have to keep it so cold. It's only going to last a matter of hours in your body. But the consequences, the immunity it will provoke, hopefully will last for years, if not for life. So I'm kind of excited about that one, but I'd take the AstraZeneca one. I've tried to sign up for trials. Susan and I were talking about this earlier. People don't want me for some reason. Yeah, and even the inactivated viruses, when they come out, they're kind of old school, but they work. They work, yeah.
So I think the take-home message is that which vaccine should you take? The one you can get.
Yes, the one CVS has.
Yeah. Once it passes the approval and it has been through these robust tests that they're all going through, I would have no hesitation whatsoever about getting any of them that have passed that approval. And I will say I have signed up for a trial, so I'm happy to be a guinea pig as well. All right, so I'm looking and I'm seeing that I think we've handled all of our questions, or most of them anyway. I thank you, attendees, for attending. And in the chat, you will see a link, which will be where this recording will be in a few days. And we invite you to view it again or share it. And we'd like to thank you very much for attending this last of the season of our Dornsife Dialogues.